This story is about a family vacationing in a desert location, where ancient, malevolent forces are awakened by their presence. The Johnson family, Mark, Sarah, and their two children, 16-year-old Emily and 10-year-old Ben, drove their dusty SUV into the small oasis town of Alcera. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the air into a shimmering haze. After hours of driving through barren landscapes, the sight of palm trees and a glimmering pool of water was a welcome relief. Alcera was a collection of low, mud brick buildings clustered around a central market square. The air was thick with the scent of spices and dates. They checked into the only hotel in town, a crumbling edifice called the Desert Rose. The lobby was dimly lit and sparsely furnished, with faded carpets and peeling wallpaper. The receptionist, a gaunt man with dark circles under his eyes, greeted them with a weary smile. He spoke broken English, but managed to convey that their rooms were on the second floor. Their rooms were basic but clean, with small windows overlooking the dusty streets. As Mark unloaded the luggage, Emily complained about the lack of Wi-Fi, while Ben excitedly explored the room, jumping on the creaky beds. Sarah, ever the optimist, tried to reassure them that they were here for an adventure, a chance to disconnect from their usual routine. That evening, they ventured into the market square. The square was bustling with activity, filled with vendors selling everything from hand-woven rugs to exotic fruits. The sounds of bartering, laughter, and music filled the air. They ate dinner at a small stall, enjoying delicious grilled meats and flatbread. As the sun began to set, the sky turned a vibrant shade of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the sand. After dinner, they decided to take a short walk into the desert. The air was cooler now, and the silence was broken only by the soft crunch of sand under their feet. As they walked further from the town, the stars became brighter, illuminating the vast expanse of the desert. Ben, ever curious, picked up a strange, smooth stone. It was an unusual shade of deep red. Suddenly, a low whisper seemed to emanate from the sand. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. She dismissed it as the wind, but as they turned to head back to town, the whisper grew louder, a chorus of voices murmuring in an unknown language. Ben clutched the red stone tightly in his hand. As they hurried back to the hotel, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Back in their rooms, the whispers seemed to follow them. Sarah tossed and turned in her bed, unable to sleep. She kept hearing the faint murmurs, even with the windows closed. She looked out the window and saw nothing but the vast, silent desert under the moonlight. But the whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent, as if the desert itself was trying to communicate with them. The following day, the Johnsons tried to put the unsettling experience of the previous night behind them. They explored the town, visiting the local museum, which housed a collection of ancient artifacts discovered in the surrounding desert. The exhibits spoke of a lost civilization that had once thrived in the area, a people who worshipped strange deities and practiced mysterious rituals. One display featured a collection of smooth, red stones, similar to the one Ben had found. The accompanying description mentioned that these stones were believed to be conduits to the spirit world. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she read the inscription. That afternoon, they decided to take a guided tour of the desert. Their guide, a local Bedouin named Omar, was a wiry man with weathered features and piercing eyes. As they drove deeper into the desert in Omar's battered Jeep, the landscape became increasingly desolate. Towering sand dunes stretched as far as the eye could see, and the only signs of life were the occasional thorny bushes and scorpions scurrying across the sand. As the sun began to set, Omar stopped the Jeep at the foot of a massive dune. He explained that this was a sacred site, a place where the ancient people had once performed their rituals. He warned them not to stray too far from the group, as the desert could be treacherous, especially at night. As they climbed the dune, the whispers returned, louder than before. They seemed to emanate from the sand itself, a chorus of voices murmuring in a language they didn't understand. Ben, clutching the red stone in his pocket, seemed unfazed by the whispers, but Emily grew increasingly agitated. She complained of a headache and a feeling of being watched. At the top of the dune, they were greeted by a breathtaking view of the desert landscape bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. But the beauty of the scene was overshadowed by the growing intensity of the whispers. They were now so loud that they could almost make out individual words, though they remained unintelligible. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept across the dune, carrying with it a cloud of sand. As the sand swirled around them, the whispers intensified, becoming a cacophony of voices screaming in their ears. Emily screamed and covered her ears, while Ben simply stared out at the desert, a strange look of fascination on his face. Omar, his eyes wide with fear, grabbed the family and hurried them back down the dune. Back at the hotel, the whispers continued to plague them. They were now present even inside their rooms, seeping through the walls and under the doors. Sarah tried to convince herself that it was all in their heads, but the growing sense of dread was undeniable. She knew that something was terribly wrong. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The whispers had become a constant drone, a relentless assault on her senses. She lay in bed, listening to the murmurs, trying to decipher their meaning. They seemed to be calling out a name she couldn't quite grasp. Around midnight, she heard a noise coming from Ben's room. She got out of bed and cautiously opened the connecting door. Ben was not in his bed. The window was open, and a cool desert breeze was blowing into the room. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She rushed to the window and looked out. In the distance, she saw a small figure walking towards the desert. It was Ben. He was walking slowly, as if in a trance, his arms outstretched. Sarah ran out of the hotel and into the street. The town was deserted, the only sound the whispering wind. She followed Ben's tracks in the sand, her heart filled with dread. The whispers grew louder as she approached the desert, as if the very sands were calling to him. She followed his tracks to the foot of the same large dune they had visited the previous day. At the top of the dune, she saw a group of figures gathered around a small fire. In the center of the group stood Ben, holding the red stone aloft. As Sarah got closer, she could see that the figures were not human. They were tall and gaunt, with long, skeletal limbs and faces hidden by dark hoods. They were chanting in a low, rhythmic voice, their words echoing across the desert. The whispers had now become a unified chorus, a powerful incantation. Sarah realized with horror that they were performing a ritual, and Ben was the focal point. The red stone he held was the key, a conduit for some ancient, malevolent force. She screamed Ben's name, but he didn't respond. He seemed to be in a trance, his eyes fixed on the fire. The hooded figures turned towards Sarah, their faces still hidden by their hoods. They raised their arms towards her, and the whispers intensified, becoming a deafening roar. Sarah felt a surge of fear unlike anything she had ever experienced. She knew that she had to save her son, but she was powerless against these ancient, otherworldly beings. Sarah, desperate, charged up the dune towards the ritual. As she reached the top, the hooded figures turned their attention fully to her. The chanting intensified, and the fire blazed higher, casting eerie shadows across the sand. Ben remained motionless, his eyes glazed over, the red stone still held high. One of the figures, seemingly the leader, stepped forward. It was taller than the others, and its hood was adorned with strange symbols. It raised a hand toward Sarah, and a powerful gust of wind swept across the dune, throwing sand into her face. The whispers became a piercing shriek, assaulting her ears. Sarah stumbled back, blinded by the sand and overwhelmed by the noise. She felt a sharp pain in her head, as if her skull was being crushed. She fell to her knees, her vision blurring. As she struggled to regain her footing, she saw the leader of the figures approach Ben. It took the red stone from his hand and placed it on a small altar that had been built near the fire. As the stone touched the altar, a blinding flash of light erupted, followed by a deafening roar. The ground began to tremble, and cracks appeared in the sand. A swirling vortex of sand and wind formed above the altar, growing larger and larger. The hooded figures began to chant even louder, their voices reaching a fever pitch. Sarah, barely conscious, saw Ben collapse to the ground. The vortex above the altar began to pull everything towards it, including the fire, the hooded figures, and Ben. Sarah tried to reach him, but she was too weak. The vortex grew even larger, engulfing everything in its path. The last thing Sarah saw was Ben's lifeless form being pulled into the swirling sand before darkness consumed her. The next morning, a search party from Al-Sarah found Sarah unconscious at the foot of the dune. There was no sign of Ben or the hooded figures. The only evidence of the previous night's events was a small, scorched patch of sand at the top of the dune and the deep, unsettling silence that had fallen over the desert. The whispers were gone, but the desert had claimed its due. The red stone was never found. The people of Al-Sarah never spoke of the incident again, and the dune was forever considered a cursed place, a reminder of the ancient forces that lay dormant beneath the whispering sands. This story focuses on a group of friends who take a trip to a remote island rumored to be haunted by the spirits of drowned children and covered in unsettling dolls. The rusty ferry groaned and swayed as it cut through the choppy waters, leaving a trail of white foam in its wake. Liam, Maya, Chloe, and Noah huddled together on the deck, trying to shield themselves from the biting wind and the spray of the sea. They were on their way to Isla de las Muñecas, the island of dolls, a small, isolated island off the coast of Mexico, notorious for its macabre history. Liam, the group's self-proclaimed thrill-seeker, had convinced them to make the trip. He had heard tales of the island's unsettling atmosphere, its thousands of decaying dolls hanging from trees, and the tragic story of the man who had dedicated his life to collecting them. Maya, the skeptical one, had initially resisted the idea, but the others had eventually persuaded her. Chloe, the artist, was drawn to the island's eerie beauty, while Noah, the quiet observer, was simply curious. The journey was long and uncomfortable. The ferry was old and overcrowded, filled with locals returning to their villages and a few other tourists drawn by the island's dark allure. The air was thick with the smell of salt, fish, and diesel fumes. As they approached the island, a thick fog rolled in, shrouding it in an eerie mist. When they finally arrived, the sight that greeted them was truly disturbing. The island was small and densely vegetated, with gnarled trees and tangled vines growing down to the water's edge. Hanging from the trees, in every conceivable space, were dolls. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of them. Some were old and tattered, their porcelain faces cracked and faded. Others were newer, plastic dolls, their bright colors contrasting starkly with the decaying surroundings. Some were missing limbs, others were decapitated, their empty eye sockets staring blankly out at the sea. The ferry docked at a small, dilapidated pier. The only building on the island was a small, abandoned shack. The fog made everything seem muted and surreal. The air was heavy with a strange, sweet smell, like decaying flowers mixed with something metallic. As they stepped off the ferry, a gust of wind swept across the island, causing the dolls to sway and creak, their plastic eyes seeming to follow their every move. The sound was unnerving, like a chorus of whispers. Maya shivered, a sense of unease settling over her. Even Liam seemed a little shaken by the sight. They decided to explore the island, following a narrow, overgrown path that led into the interior. The deeper they went, the more dolls they saw. They were everywhere, hanging from branches, nestled in bushes, perched on rocks. Some were tied together with rope, forming grotesque clusters. Others were impaled on sticks, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. The silence of the island, broken only by the creaking of the dolls and the rustling of the leaves, was oppressive. It felt as if they were being watched, surrounded by the silent, judging eyes of the dolls. As the group ventured deeper into the island, the atmosphere grew heavier. The dolls seemed to become more numerous, their vacant stares following them wherever they went. Chloe, initially fascinated by the macabre spectacle, started to feel increasingly uneasy. She noticed that some of the dolls seemed to be positioned in specific ways, as if they were arranged in some kind of pattern or ritual. Liam, trying to maintain his bravado, joked about the dolls being creepy decorations, but even he couldn't deny the unsettling feeling that they were being watched. Maya, her skepticism turning into genuine fear, suggested they turn back, but Liam insisted on exploring further. They came across a small clearing in the center of the island. In the middle of the clearing stood a dilapidated shack, its windows boarded up and its roof partially collapsed. More dolls hung from the trees surrounding the shack, some of them larger and more elaborate than the ones they had seen before. As they approached the shack, they heard a faint whisper, seemingly coming from inside. It was a child's voice, soft and mournful, calling out a name they couldn't quite understand. The whisper sent shivers down their spines. Noah, who had been unusually quiet throughout the exploration, suddenly pointed to a doll hanging from a nearby tree. It was a porcelain doll with cracked features and empty eye sockets. Around its neck was tied a small, faded photograph. Liam carefully took the photograph. It was a picture of a young girl, smiling brightly. On the back of the photograph, a name was written in faded ink. Maria. The name seemed to echo the whisper they had just heard. As they examined the photograph, the wind picked up, causing the dolls to sway and creak even more violently. The whispers intensified, becoming a chorus of mournful voices, all calling out the name Maria. The air grew cold, and a sense of dread washed over the group. They felt as if they had stumbled upon something they weren't meant to see. Suddenly, Chloe screamed. She pointed to the shack. One of the boarded-up windows had come loose, revealing a dark, empty space inside. And within that darkness, they saw something move. A small, shadowy figure, barely visible in the gloom. The figure retreated back into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared, but the brief glimpse was enough to terrify them. They turned and ran, not stopping until they reached the pier. Back on the mainland, the group tried to rationalize what they had seen, but the image of the shadowy figure in the shack haunted them. They couldn't shake the feeling that they had disturbed something terrible on the island. Liam, despite his initial bravado, was now deeply shaken. He researched the island's history and discovered the tragic story of Don Julian Santana Barrera, the man who had created the Island of Dolls. According to local legend, Don Julian had found the body of a drowned girl near his property and, haunted by her spirit, began collecting dolls to appease her. The more Liam learned, the more disturbed he became. He discovered that the name Maria was indeed the name of the drowned girl. He also found accounts of strange occurrences on the island, whispers, apparitions, and the feeling of being watched. Driven by a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity, Liam decided to return to the island alone. He didn't tell the others, not wanting to put them in danger again. He hired a local fisherman to take him back to Isla de las Muñecas. When he arrived, the island was even more desolate than before. The fog had lifted, but the atmosphere was still oppressive. The dolls seemed to be watching him, their empty eyes following his every move. Liam went straight to the clearing and approached the shack. He cautiously removed the loose board from the window and peered inside. The interior was dark and dusty, filled with more dolls, some of them arranged in disturbing poses. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw something in the corner of the shack. It was a small, crudely made altar, covered in offerings, flowers, toys, and more dolls. And on the altar, he saw the photograph of Maria, the one they had found tied to the doll. Suddenly, he heard a sound behind him. He turned around and saw a small figure standing in the doorway of the shack. It was a child, a girl with long, dark hair and pale skin. She was holding a doll in her arms. Liam was speechless. He didn't know what to say. The girl simply stared at him with wide, dark eyes. Then, she raised her hand and pointed to the altar. Liam, still stunned, slowly approached the girl. He noticed that she was barefoot and her clothes were old and tattered. She looked like she had been living on the island for a long time. He tried to speak to her, but she didn't respond. She just kept staring at him, her dark eyes filled with a deep sadness. He realized that she was likely the spirit of Maria, the drowned girl. He looked back at the altar and understood. Don Julian hadn't just collected dolls. He had been trying to create a home for Maria's spirit, a place where she could feel safe and loved. The dolls were not just decorations. They were companions, protectors. The girl slowly walked towards the altar and placed the doll she was holding next to the photograph. Then, she turned back to Liam and smiled. It was a sad, gentle smile, but it conveyed a sense of peace. Suddenly, the wind picked up again, and the dolls outside began to sway and creak. But this time, the sound was different. It wasn't a mournful whisper. It was a soft, gentle lullaby. Liam felt a sense of calm wash over him. He understood that Maria was finally at peace. Her spirit was no longer trapped on the island. Don Julian's efforts, though strange and unsettling, had ultimately succeeded. He turned to leave the shack, but when he looked back, the girl was gone. The only thing left was the altar, the photograph, and the dolls. He walked out of the shack and back towards the pier, the sound of the gentle lullaby following him. When he returned to the mainland, he told the others what he had seen. They were shocked and saddened by the story, but they also felt a sense of closure. They knew that Maria's spirit was finally at rest. The island of dolls remained a strange and unsettling place, but it was no longer a place of fear and dread. It was a place of remembrance, a testament to the enduring power of love and the enduring presence of the past. This story is about a group of scuba divers who explore a sunken resort and uncover a dark secret lurking within its depths. The turquoise waters of the Caribbean shimmered under the morning sun as the dive boat, the Neptune's Pearl, sliced through the gentle waves. On board were 4 experienced scuba divers: Jake, the seasoned veteran and leader of the group; Sarah, the marine biologist with a passion for underwater life; Ben, the tech expert and underwater photographer; and Lisa, the adventurous newcomer eager to explore the depths. Their destination was the Coralia Resort, a once luxurious hotel that had been swallowed by the sea during a devastating hurricane 10 years prior. Now a popular dive site, it was known for its preserved structure and the abundant marine life that had made it their home. Jake briefed the group on the dive plan. They would descend to a depth of approximately 80 feet, explore the main lobby and some of the lower-level suites, and then ascend slowly, making necessary decompression stops. He emphasized the importance of staying together and following the dive signals. As they geared up, the excitement was palpable. Sarah was eager to document the coral growth and the diverse fish species inhabiting the wreck. Ben was preparing his underwater camera, hoping to capture stunning images of the sunken resort. Lisa, though a bit nervous, was thrilled to experience her first wreck dive. They entered the water one by one, giving the bouquet signal before descending. The visibility was excellent, and as they descended, the outline of the resort began to emerge from the blue depths. It was an eerie sight, a once grand building now covered in coral and barnacles, a silent testament to the power of nature. The main lobby was surprisingly intact. The grand staircase, though encrusted with coral, was still recognizable. The chandeliers, now home to schools of small fish, hung suspended in the water, casting ghostly shadows. The reception desk, where guests once checked in, was now a feeding ground for colorful reef fish. As they explored the lobby, they noticed something strange. Scattered among the debris were personal belongings, suitcases, clothes, and even children's toys. It was a stark reminder of the lives that had been disrupted by the hurricane. Ben signaled to Jake and pointed to a child's doll lying near a collapsed pillar. It was a porcelain doll, its painted face partially chipped, but its glassy eyes still stared blankly ahead. A chill ran down Jake's spine. He had heard rumors that some people had perished in the resort during the hurricane, but he had always dismissed them as mere stories. The discovery of the doll cast a somber mood over the dive. The group continued to explore the lower levels of the resort, but the lighthearted atmosphere had dissipated. They moved through the hallways, peering into the former guest rooms, now filled with silt and debris. In one of the rooms, Sarah discovered a collection of photographs scattered on the floor. They were faded and waterlogged, but she could make out images of families, couples, and children. It was clear that these were personal mementos, cherished memories lost to the sea. As Ben photographed the scene, he noticed something in the background of one of his shots. It was a faint, shadowy figure, barely visible in the murky water. He zoomed in on the image and realized with a jolt that it resembled a human form. He showed the picture to Jake, who examined it closely. The figure was indistinct, but it was undeniably there. It seemed to be standing in the doorway of the room, as if watching them. A sense of unease settled over them. They couldn't explain the figure, but they felt a distinct presence in the room, a feeling that they were not alone. They decided to move on, but as they swam down the hallway, they heard a faint sound. It was a muffled sob, seemingly coming from deeper within the resort. The sound was faint and distorted by the water, but they all heard it. Lisa, already nervous from the discovery of the doll, was now visibly shaken. She signaled to Jake that she wanted to ascend. Jake, sensing the growing unease among the group, agreed. They began their slow ascent, making the necessary decompression stops. As they ascended, the sounds grew louder. The sobs were now accompanied by whispers, faint and unintelligible, but undeniably present. They felt as if they were being followed, pursued by an unseen presence. When they finally reached the surface, they were all relieved to be back in the sunlight. But the experience had left a lasting impression. They couldn't shake the feeling that they had encountered something truly unsettling in the depths of the sunken resort. Back on the boat, Ben reviewed the photos he had taken during the dive. He zoomed in on the image of the shadowy figure and enhanced it using his computer. The figure became slightly clearer, revealing what appeared to be the outline of a woman in a long dress. He also analyzed the audio recordings from his underwater camera. He filtered out the background noise and was able to isolate the faint sounds they had heard. The sobs were indeed human, and the whispers, though still unintelligible, seemed to be calling out a name. He cross-referenced the name with the resort's guest registry from the time of the hurricane and discovered a match. The name was Eleanor Vance, a woman who had been staying at the resort with her young daughter. They were both presumed lost at sea during the hurricane. The discovery sent chills down their spines. They realized that they had likely encountered the spirit of Eleanor, still searching for her lost daughter. They felt a sense of responsibility to find out more, to bring closure to this tragic story. They decided to return to the dive site the next day, this time with a specific purpose: to search for any trace of Eleanor's daughter. They carefully planned their dive, focusing on the area where they had seen the shadowy figure and heard the sobs. The next day, they descended to the same area of the resort. The atmosphere was even more oppressive than before. The water seemed colder, and the visibility was slightly reduced. They carefully searched the rooms, moving slowly and cautiously. In one of the rooms, they found a small, wooden toy chest hidden under a pile of debris. Inside the chest, they found a doll identical to the one they had found in the lobby. As Ben picked up the doll, they heard the sobs again, this time much closer. They turned and saw the shadowy figure of Eleanor, standing in the doorway. She was no longer just a faint outline. She was more distinct, her features clearly visible. She looked directly at the doll in Ben's hand, and her expression softened. Suddenly, a small, glowing orb appeared beside Eleanor. It hovered for a moment, then moved towards the doll in Ben's hand. As the orb touched the doll, the sobs ceased, and a sense of peace filled the water. Eleanor smiled, a sad but grateful smile, then slowly faded away, the glowing orb disappearing with her. They understood that they had reunited Eleanor with her daughter's spirit, bringing closure to their tragic story. They left the doll in the toy chest, a small memorial to the lost souls of the Coralia Resort. As they ascended, they felt a sense of relief and a deep respect for the power of the past and the enduring bonds of love. The sunken resort remained a silent testament to the hurricane's devastation, but it was no longer a place of fear. It was a place of remembrance, a place where a mother and daughter were finally reunited in the deep.